Welcome back to Unveiling the Covenant, where we explore the mysteries of sacred scripture and the covenant love of God the Father from the heart of the church. My name is Marcus Peter, your regular host. If you've been following the program, you will realize, or at least remember, that we've been going through covenant themes in each book of the Bible after having gone through an overarching examination of the covenants. In this episode, I'd like to continue the discussion of the theme of covenant at large throughout sacred scripture. My guest today is a dear friend, Kevin Clarke, Dr. Kevin Clarke. Kevin and I met in Ave Maria University, and he received his PhD there. He is a patristic scholar, and he is most recently the Dean of the Institute for Lay Ministry at Sacred Heart Major Seminary here in Detroit. And we're really blessed to be able to be living so close to each other and work with each other once again. Kevin, it's an honor to have you on the program. How are you doing, good sir?
I'm doing great. Thanks for having me on, Marcus. It's a great pleasure.
Truly, the honor's all mine. So, Kevin, just for the interest of our listeners, you're rather new to the area, and I'm so glad that you get to share in the work that we do here at Ave Maria Radio. So, tell us what you're doing at the seminary, and then also eventually share with us some of the research you're doing.
Great. Yes, so I'm Dean of the Institute for Lay Ministry, as you mentioned, and what that means is that I essentially oversee all aspects of formation for lay students. And in the seminary, we go through 4 aspects of formation: the intellectual aspect, the pastoral aspect, the spiritual, and then the human. And so I work with our lay students and help make sure that they're meeting those formation goals. And it's a great experience to see the formation of the whole person, as we like to say, where in the university experience you might not get that completely holistic formation where you're thinking about your own human formation. How are my communication skills? How are am I growing in the natural virtues? That's not completely integral to one's formation in a university setting, but it is at Sacred Heart, and so it's a really special place. We have fantastic students, and I'm really blessed to be in this new role.
And I have to tell you, first of all, not only in your new role and in your department, but just Sacred Heart at large, you guys do so much excellently in terms of not just forming priests and religious, but ministers of the next generation, ministers of the gospel of the next generation. So just at large, talk to us about some of the great things that's happening at Sacred Heart, because it seems like every single time I turn my head, something wonderful is coming out of there.
Yes, well, I would encourage your listeners to go to Sacred Heart, shms.edu, click on the academics link at the top of the page, and explore our programming. See what all we offer. And there are so many things that we do. We have, for those who simply want ongoing formation, we have our Equip platform, and you can sign up for these free or low-cost courses that you can take and get the student experience, right? So that's an interesting possibility as well. So go to Sacred Heart, shms.edu, click on Equip, see what we have to offer. But I would encourage, above all, the listeners who think you might have a vocation to the priesthood to really pray about that and really explore how God is speaking in your own heart. Because central to what we do at the seminary, of course, is priestly formation. And we, as a church, and you've experienced this with the Archdiocese here in Detroit, how every week we're turning to the Lord of the harvest to pray that He will send harvesters into the field to answer the vocation to the ministerial priesthood. But we're all called to holiness, whether it be the clergy or religious or laity. We have to answer God's call in our own lives. So there's options for everyone at Sacred Heart.
That's fantastic. That truly is. So, Kevin, tell us about some of the things that you've been researching. You and I share similar hearts for a lot of things, our love for sacred scripture, albeit our leans, the way we look at scripture is different yet very complementary. You're a patristic scholar, so tell us about some of the research you've been working on lately.
Yeah, thank you, Marcus. I recently had a book published, a collection of essays from about 20 different scholars I have an essay of my own in there, but it's on patristic spirituality. It was published by Brill, so I would encourage folks to check that out. Patristic spirituality, essays on the ascent to God. And I've been doing a lot of work. I wrote my dissertation on Maximus the Confessor. Mm-hmm. He is my favorite of the church fathers. Of course, Augustine, I like to say, was my gateway drug to the fathers.
I remember you saying
that.
Yes,
but Maximus really captured my heart, the depth of his theology. And so I wrote my dissertation on Maximus. But above all, I'm really interested in patristic exegesis. And what that means is the way the fathers interpreted the Bible. And so that has, with the biblical theology background at Ave Maria and the patristic nature of my focus, that's challenged me to participate, as it were, in two fields at the same time. But fortunately, there's quite a community of scholars who really are devoting themselves to the patristic study or the study of how the fathers interpreted the Bible. Yeah.
And I have to say, I remember reading portions of your dissertation when you shared it with me, and Maximus makes Scripture come alive in ways that very few other fathers, and it's not that they don't have their own gifts, but Maximus gets not only to the heart, he's almost poetic about the way he does it, and then you were pretty poetic about flowering Maximus's work. So going back to this theme of patristic exegesis, then the program is Unveiling the Covenants. We were going to talk about Irenaeus and his Adversus Heresies against the Heresies. So let's just dive into that. Let's talk about certain themes of how the fathers talked about Scripture, and let's chew out what the fathers would teach us about understanding covenants and Scripture in our life.
Yes. So Irenaeus, as your viewers may know, he was recently declared a doctor of the church by Pope Francis.
About time.
Yes. And so now he is the oldest doctor of the church. He's the earliest in history of the doctors of the church. Before Irenaeus, there were no doctors of the church. Now that might change. Perhaps they'll name Ignatius of Antioch a doctor of the church. May God allow it. But Irenaeus is really fascinating for me personally because I would say that it was Irenaeus who drew my attention to the problem of patristic exegesis. And one of the things where we also share a background is that we both participated in the Papist Patristic Institute in Boston. And for those who don't know the Papist Patristic Institute, many of us would come together for a week over the summers and basically just look closely at patristic texts, talk about them together, study them, and learn from them. And my first time being involved with the Papist Patristic Institute, I took a class on Irenaeus. And we looked really closely at this beautiful passage in Book 1 of Against the Heresies, chapter 8, if for those who are watching want to find it on the public domain, where Irenaeus gives this example of a beautiful mosaic of a king that's been wisely arranged by an artist. And
just to fill in, and the mosaic is done with jewels.
Right. Beautiful pieces of jewelry, precious stones and whatnot. It's in the image of a king. Now, his point, though, is that he wishes to criticize the Gnostics, those who claimed to have a sort of a knowledge of the mysteries. And so they made themselves really important in the 2nd century, where how would you understand the Scriptures without the Gnostic preachers coming around and explaining the impossible to find meanings, right? So Irenaeus takes this mosaic, and for the Gnostics, they break it apart, and they rearrange it and they do it in a very poor, shoddy way, into a new image of, Irenaeus says, either a dog or a fox. And they say, that is the king. And what Irenaeus means to show by this is that the original image of the king, arranged by the wise artist, this is the unity of the scriptures, the analogy of the faith. And of course, God is the one who has wisely arranged everything. And their fragmentary reading takes that providential, wise ordering apart and confuses people into thinking that the image is something it's not.
Exactly. So now, when Irenaeus was writing this, he was combating the Valentinian heresy.
That's right.
So for those of you who are listening, Kevin, just help us understand. You mentioned Gnosticism, and I just threw out the Valentinian heresy. So what's Gnosticism, first of all, and then a little background on the Valentinian heresy, and then we can move on to the next theme I wanted to talk about.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you, Marcus. That's a great question. So Valentinians were essentially a type of Gnosticism. Gnosticism is a broad category, so to speak, in the early church where they claim to have, as I mentioned before, a kind of an inner knowledge. And so the Valentinian Gnosticism advanced a teaching of the cosmogony, where you had different, almost like deities, who were coming into existence at various times, and so it strikes the reader as a very pagan or mythological cosmogony, which means an account of the origin of the deities, right? And so Irenaeus, his point is going to be to direct his audience to what he calls the rule of faith, the regula fidei. And so this rule of faith is divinely given. And that's the point exactly, because if there is a mosaic of a king, if there is an image put together that is the whole of the scriptures together, that means that there already is something in place that can't just simply be taken apart.
Right.
Right.
So sorry, I just want to build on that. So you mentioned the rule of faith and the analogy of faith. Again, help us understand how that applies to the scriptures.
Right. So the analogy of faith means that you're not going to have something in the faith that's contradictory. Right. And so the analogy of faith, this is one of the reasons why we vehemently reject tritheism, right? Because we know from the scriptures that God is one, right? And so our Trinitarian account of the Godhead is one that affirms the unity of the divine essence, but the Trinity of persons, right? And so anytime you have something, a doctrine of some kind, it has to be tested against, as it were, the harmony and the way that the faith fits together. I can't remember which place in the Catechism this is, but I think it's around in paragraphs 120s somewhere, and it's central, and it comes, I believe, right after the Church's teachings on the senses of Scripture, which maybe we can talk about at some point. But you know, what was interesting about that Irenaeus class was that it introduced me to the idea that there were those in the patristic community who argued for plural Christianities, right? And this is something that I'm a member of the National or North American Patristic Society, that members have been pushing for a while, this idea of changing the name because of the fatherliness or the maleness of patristics.
I remember this, yes.
And so one of the proposed names would be Society of Early Christianities, right? But there is no Christianities. There only is Christianity. It is one. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father over all. So, and that's what Irenaeus is asserting, that you have this unity, and it's radically compromised by the Gnostic position.
Right. Thank you. We're talking to Dr. Kevin Clarke, who is the newest dean of the Institute of Lay Ministry at Sacred Heart Major Seminary. He's also associate professor there, and he's a patristic scholar and a dear friend of mine. So let's continue into this. So what Irenaeus does, he does this so beautifully, so poetically, but at the same time, he really doesn't pull punches. He basically slams them and says, well, you don't have the right to do this.
Yes, and he gives a really interesting example in his a couple of chapters later, where he takes various lines from the Homeric canon and stitches them together, and they tell a new story. But the point is that they're each about a different character from the works of Homer.
Right.
But the way that it's written is made to sound as though it's about Hermes, I believe, if I'm remembering correctly. And Irenaeus' point is that we wouldn't tolerate this on that anyone should do this to the Homeric canon.
Right. And we don't even do this to any other text.
Right.
Can you imagine doing that to a history textbook?
Right. No, of course not. But the point is that why would we tolerate it when it comes to the Bible? The word that God has given to us, that He has inspired, He has poured out His Spirit into the human author to providentially guide the author to record all that the Lord wished to reveal. So, and that was one of the perks of being a Gnostic preacher is that you could go around and make all these connections and do whatever you wanted with the text, and say that this text about Sophia or wisdom is actually in reference to the divinity Sophia, and so it created almost like a dependency upon the preacher, which we see in situations where there comes to be religious abuse. There's that codependency between the one who is super enlightened and so you're always coming back. So and that's an interesting potential future path for studies in the 2nd century of the psychology of, and that's another interest I have, psychology, but the psychology of being one of these charismatic, heretical preachers who basically can get away with saying whatever he wants.
And you think about this on a modern perspective. When Irenaeus wrote this, he had no concept of what was going to happen in 1521. And yet today, with all the, you know this, I come from a Protestant background, and while I was in the Assemblies of God, cherry-picking verses was exactly what we were taught to do. And you were taught to hinge your entire sermon upon verses that have been cherry-picked and strung together. And Irenaeus is condemning exactly that. So there's this present-day implication for how we ought to read the Bible as well.
That's right. Irenaeus invites us to take a step back and take yet 3 or 4 more steps back and look at the image, right? And I think this is a challenge for Catholics when they come to the Bible, is that they just want to pour themselves into the text and start from the beginning. Of course, that makes all the sense in the world, but at the same time, we have to see the big picture. We have to see the story of salvation and how we ourselves fit into that story. And so, this. But you're exactly right. The evangelical reading of Scripture will sometimes exclude the interpretation of certain verses, right? And I grew up in southwestern Virginia in the Roanoke area. It was about 4% Catholic. So I had many Baptist friends growing up, and if you try to talk with them about the the necessity of baptism for salvation, or the bread of life discourse, then suddenly they want to create the spiritual senses so that they can.
The Bible is literal, unless those literal things contradict what I believe, and then it's suddenly spiritual.
Exactly, but see, it's the church's the living context of the church's faith and the tradition that helps to signal to the reader what is the accurate interpretation of the bread of life discourse. It's the Eucharist is the context that helps us to understand what Jesus means here when he says that unless you eat my flesh and drink my blood, you will have no life within you.
Exactly.
Right? And then the necessity of baptism in John 3 and whatnot. So it's a beautiful and blessed thing to be able to read the Bible as a Catholic in communion with the Church and be guided to the right interpretation of Scripture.
Right. I remember when I was studying my way into the Church and I came upon John 6 and the Catholic argument for John 6. Now, you would remember me sharing this with you. I was so ignorant, I didn't even know what I didn't know. But I came across John 6:55, and Jesus says, no, my flesh is real food. My blood is real drink. And the Greek doesn't mince that. Like he means, no, it's genuine food and genuine drink. And then everyone leaves, like a good load of his disciples leave him at the end. They wouldn't do that for something that's figurative.
Right. And he would say, oh, no, guys,
That's right.
You're taking me literally. I mean this in a figurative way.
In a spiritual sense.
What kind of teacher would he be to let his disciples depart from him over a misunderstanding?
That's right. And so what Irenaeus is trying to remind us is that when we read Scripture, we cannot do... So what you've been kind of skirting around here with is the concept of eisegesis and exegesis. We have about 5 minutes or so in the program. Very briefly, these words are thrown around in Bible study, and a lot of Catholics just don't understand what those words mean. So what are those words, and what ought we to do when reading the Bible?
Yeah, that's a great question. Exegesis means to bring something out of a text. It is often translated as, it is translated as exegesis. It's related to the word hermeneutics, which has to do with interpretation. And so there are many things in the text to be brought out of the text. On the one hand, any human work requires a kind of an exegesis. We want to know what the author meant by this. What are we to understand by this? I write tons of emails a day. Not all of them are have I communicated myself perfectly, right? And so they require a follow-up email. And so there's a kind of an exegesis that we do all the time. Now, eisegesis, though, it comes from two Greek words, eis, which means into, and ago, which means to lead. So exegesis, ex, out of, leading out of, eisegesis, leading into. That's when I take my own thoughts and put it into the text. That's when I have a bias that I confirm by how I interpret the text. So, not to call whole communities out on this, but if the Jehovah's Witnesses, for example, they will take certain passages completely out of their context and project into the text their own beliefs, their own context. Mormons as well. They'll make use of the Bible, but they'll project their own thought into it in a way that the human author didn't intend. So the task of exegesis is to determine the intended meaning of the human author. But, and there's a big but here, we have to remember that like the Eucharist, which is body, blood, soul, which refers to Christ's humanity and divinity, which refers to his divinity. In the sacred scriptures, the Word, the Logos, has allowed himself to be clothed with letters. He has become enfleshed in the sacred page in a way. Not in the same kind of presence that he is in the Eucharist, obviously, but this is one of the reasons why the Church processes with the Gospels as part of both the Western liturgy and the Eastern liturgy in its own way. So the Church accords a special place to the Scriptures because it's both divine and human. There is an element of mystery there. And so you have what are called the senses of Scripture. We'll probably have to talk about that next time. Yeah. But the senses of Scripture, you have both the literal and the spiritual. And the human author has a kind of a special access to the divine mysteries as he's writing. And that's what he communicates in the sacred page. And so that's part of exegesis too, is discerning the spiritual sense.
That's amazing, Kevin, and that's a fantastic place for us to draw to a close for this episode. We want to thank you for joining us on this episode of Unveiling the Covenants. We've been talking to Dr. Kevin Clarke, who is the newest Dean of the Institute of Lay Ministry at Sacred Heart Major Seminary. He is also Associate Professor there, and he's a patristic scholar and a dear friend. Stay tuned to next month's episode where Dr. Kevin Clarke comes back into the studio to continue this conversation with us. And I want to urge you to start looking at your scriptures as well, through the mosaic, the lens, the grand view of salvation history and covenant theology. Until next time, God bless you and keep you always. I'm Marcus Peter.